John, could you go into some more detail on this blackmail theme of how Bush might be subject to blackmail because of his involvement in the CIA and in other activities during the Reagan administration? What would be an example of this, and how would such blackmail work?
Well, let's go into the most obvious case that we know of, the one that we have the best documented so far. And this is this Black Eagle thing that was started in '82. Essentially, in a reversal of roles, the CIA is actually created to give the White House and the executive plausible deniability, so they can keep clean, and if the CIA does something wrong, they can, well, we didn't know about it, and they can fire the CIA's director. William Casey reversed this policy, and it was actually quite clever in retrospect in the Iran-Contra thing. He initiated the Iran-Contra thing, but he managed to have Ronald Reagan and the White House take the heat for it. He ran it through Oliver North. So it became a political thing, whereas the CIA was clearly under the thumb of the Congress, or should have been, or legally was. But he also, this Black Eagle operation of delivering arms to the Contras, he got George Bush to front for that, to use the vice president's office to front for that. And Bush was a very activist vice president, running this thing they had on anti-terrorism, supposedly, which is, of course, 1984 doublespeak for, running terrorist activities, smuggling arms. And through that operation, they began to work through Panama, and the planes flying through Panama, and Noriega gave them access to the airstrips that they needed, and immediately began working the other end of the line through the Medellín, using the same Black Eagle planes to fly drugs up here into the United States. And Bush his office was running this thing. Now, obviously, they tried to maintain what I thought was a very thin, implausible deniability of having Don Gregg running the thing right out of George Bush's office with his assistant, what's his name, Samuel Watson, and then Felix Rodriguez down in El Salvador, and then a network that went throughout, planes flying throughout, Southern Air Transport involved, their own airplanes involved, and yet the only deniability was Gregg saying, well, I never told the vice president about all of these things, which is utterly impossible. It is not within the realm of human, unless the person were a Ronald Reagan. And even then, he would have had to have known what Gregg was doing.
Can you give us a little background on Gregg, the fact that he and Bush had been together in the CIA and buddies for a long time? Yeah,
Gregg was not an original. I think he came into the CIA in '51, a graduate of Williams College. At the height, that was getting into the McCarthy era, the height of conservatism, the Korean War, a very, very conservative era. And he joined and had what was ultimately tremendously successful career. In fact, I thought that Bush would wind up appointing him as a CIA director, and instead he's gone with William Webster. The guy had to do with the destabilization of Cuba in the '60s. He wound up in Vietnam in Military Region 3 in 1970, and that's where I was, except I didn't overlap with him. But I got there just after he had left, so there were a lot of people were talking about him and about Felix Rodriguez,
who was one of his favorite operatives in Vietnam.
In the height of the Phoenix program.
And Shackley was his boss, wasn't he?
And Shackley was the boss.
So you see the same group moving in with George Bush then in the basement of the White House, right next door to Oliver North.
Minus Shackley.
Shackley wasn't.
Yeah, minus Shackley, who had been squeezed out by then.
But Shackley was still in operation, involved in a lot of these things.
Well, I'm sure the old boy thing worked so that he was in contact with them, but don't ever forget that these people fight a lot. They are as bad as people in the peace movement about squabbling, literally. You remember when Black Eagle eventually fell apart, and then the enterprise kind of came apart. Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez were at each other's throats. And these are two very volatile, unstable, dangerous men who couldn't get along. You remember the the incident that's cited in the Foreign Policy Fall 88 issue that broke Black Eagle was when the CIA operatives, it doesn't name them, and the Israeli operatives drew their pistols on each other.
This was 1985.
85.
Wow.
And they were about to start blasting each other away, and the senior head said, everybody cool it, just, you know, slow down, and prevailed and got everybody to put their guns back. And at the same time, the Pollard case was breaking, and the U.S. was going to prosecute the Pollards, and Israel didn't appreciate that, so it went through its court.
Who had been spying for Israel and
against the United States.
Right. And, you know.
Can you clarify something for me, or are you through with it? What you?
No, there's so much of this material. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused now. Oliver North's office was next door to George Bush and Donald Gregg's in the bottom of the White House, as I understand it. Now, were they working together, or as I've heard some people say, they actually had two separate arms running and drug smuggling operations going? Or were they separate but coordinated?
Well, you know, they have done everything they could to obfuscate, if you will, and confuse the issue. North admitted that he met with Bush on many occasions, but he minimized the cooperation. The way I see it is there were a number of different offices, and people did have different roles to play, and there were different power lines working. And don't ever forget that there is just a norm of every presidency since I've been around anyway, is a lot of intense competitiveness. I mean, people, they're really ruthless. Everybody's jockeying for position endlessly inside the White House and the Vice President's office, if he has any power. So North was definitely part of the same machinery. He was definitely cooperating with George Bush as Bush was cooperating with Casey. But at the same time, North was definitely beating his own drum and tooting his own horn and flying around the world grandstanding and setting his... They were not what, you know, it was not a disciplined unit like one CIA office would be, or one Marine division would be, or one of your Navy ships would be. And these are a lot of competing people who are in the same ideology, the same administration, and moving in the same direction, with the same evil intentions.
The way that the Rolling Stone told this story in their November 3rd essay on the dirty secrets of George Bush, the Black Eagle operation that Bush, Rodriguez, and Gregg were running was coming apart because of this rupture with the Israelis, and also because they found out Noriega was running so many drugs that this was threatening the integrity of the operation. So North began this other enterprise, literally called the Enterprise, with Richard Secord and Hakeem and these people to bring arms down to the Contras. But Secord had trouble getting it off, so that Felix Rodriguez began another operation, and once Secord got his going, they shut down the operation with Rodriguez's Cuban friends who had lost a lot of money in this and were very angry, and this began the tension between Rodriguez and Bush and the Secord North group, and eventually the tensions there sort of exploded, and Bush was the guy supposedly trying to hold everything together. That when these other guys, North and Rodriguez, were at each other's throats, Bush was the guy that had to smooth things over. So again, he played a major role in carrying out these operations, according at least to these this Rolling Stone story that seemed fairly well documented.
No, I endorse it. The way you describe it is the way I have read it myself very much. That in fact, the original outfit, they had built this giant warehouse called the Arms Supermarket and stocked it with arms which are supposed to be bought by the Contras with the U.S. taxpayers' dollars or the private enterprise dollars. And at the time that North pulled away from that enterprise to start the Enterprise, they had that thing stocked with $18 million worth of arms. Now, you know, arms is a cash-for business, and this cash had to come from the Medellín Colombian cocaine cartel.
Right.
So there was drug money that they had been working with that had stocked this warehouse, counting on selling the arms to the Enterprise Small E, and then North did break away at the point where he saw that thing apparently as getting out of control, as being too explosive. Now, it was not. Don't anyone misunderstand that he was morally troubled by working with people who were smuggling drugs. He had known for years these people were smuggling drugs. But as you noted, the volume of it was getting so high that he saw an earthquake coming and actually moved. There also was undoubtedly part of his ego, power play, power struggle at the level of him and Rodriguez, at the level perhaps of him and Gregg.
During this whole time, George Bush was supervisor. He was control of the anti-drug program in the United States, not just the propaganda bit, you know, just say no, but a great and very expensive operation to interdict drugs and to keep them from coming into the United States. So it was a perfect circle, not only from the propaganda point of view, because Bush could be said to be the guy who was keeping it from coming in, but on the covert aspect, he could make sure that this stuff came in undetected.
And yet, none of these stories came out during the election campaign. When I left for Europe on August the 17th, during the Republican convention, Dukakis was 10 or 15 points ahead. Bush had just nominated chosen Quayle as vice president. That looked like it was going to be a self-destruct operation. And when I came back a month later, Bush was 10 points ahead. What do you make of this? How do you analyze Bush's turning things around and winning the presidency? What was involved in this?
Well, one just quick observation is there's some false polling in the summer. After the Democratic convention, the Democrats always look better. They've gotten a lot of publicity. And then a month later, after the Republican convention, they have a surge back. And so it's sometime about the 1st of September where the polls, I think, I forget the figure, but it's something like 9 times out of 10, the one who is leading on the 1st of September wins. So it's stabilized by the end of August. And in fact, by the end of August, Bush was ahead again. The Quayle thing was a heavy hit of Bush. One might call it a major blunder, but since he succeeded, we all reflected on that a lot. His choice of Quayle, as I see it, was twofold. He had to pick someone who would make him look like a giant. And that was not easy to do. If he picked Bob Dole, for example, someone who knew more and had a stronger personality, he would have all kinds of problems. He also, in my opinion, and this is an analyst's opinion, you know, this is not based on any hard quotes or anything, very subjective, but he also had to pick someone who was bought into the Iran-Contra scandal. And Quayle was. He was the senator from Indiana, and Indiana's the state that John Hull, you know, came from, who was the man who had the ranch in Costa Rica from which all the drug smuggling and the arms, you know, from the southern side of the Contra thing had been run. And it turns out, as we dug up in August and found out, this young man working for Quayle introduced Hull to Oliver North originally, and that young man's name was Robert Owens.
And Owens so is involved in all this?
Owens was working for Quayle when he introduced John Hull. Oh yes, when he introduced John Hull to Oliver North and gave them that whole option, which evolved into the enterprise and the whole scandal.
That's incredible. The whole interconnections, all of this, even Quayle. I mean, this is amazing.
To go back, this is a very complicated thing, but I think we can sort it out. I don't think Bush dared to have someone in office who was clean of the Iran-Contra thing, like Dole, who could benefit from an impeachment.
So he needed someone that would be tainted enough with the Iran-Contra that they would be forced to resign at the same time.
They would be impeached with him, who could not possibly benefit from his impeachment. He needed to create a situation
to protect himself,
where the establishment couldn't shunt him aside and put in a strong figure like Dole or Howard Baker, who would be very acceptable to the public and to the establishment.
Right.
And that's where Quayle came. And that Barbara Honegger, who is not the world's greatest analyst, but she certainly has a lot of fire and imagination, and she coined the phrase that he was, Quayle was Bush's impeachment insurance thing that was started in '82. Essentially, in a reversal of roles, the CIA is actually created to give the White House and the executive plausible deniability, so they can keep clean, and if the CIA does something wrong, they can, well, we didn't know about it, and they can fire the CIA's director. William Casey reversed this policy, and it was actually quite clever in retrospect. And Bush was a very activist vice president running this thing they had on anti-terrorism, supposedly, which is, of course, 1984 doublespeak for, running terrorist activities, smuggling arms. And through that operation, they began to work through Panama, and the planes flying through Panama, and Noriega gave them access to the airstrips that they needed, and immediately began working the other end of the line through the Iran-Contra thing. He initiated the Iran-Contra thing, but he managed to have Ronald Reagan and the White House take the heat for it. He ran it through Oliver North. So it became a political thing, whereas the CIA was clearly under the thumb of the Congress, or should have been, or legally was. But he also, this Black Eagle operation of delivering arms to the Contras, he got George Bush to front for that, to use the Vice President's office to front for that.
John, could you go into some more detail on this blackmail theme of how Bush might be subject to blackmail because of his involvement in the CIA and in other activities during the Reagan administration? What would be an example of this, and how would such blackmail work?
Well, let's go into the most obvious case that we know of, the one that we have the best documented so far. And this is this Black Eagle, using the same Black Eagle planes to fly drugs up here into the United States. And Bush his office was running this thing. Now, obviously, they tried to maintain what I thought was a very thin, implausible deniability of having Don Gregg running the thing right out of George Bush's office with his assistant, what's his name,